So
It don't matter.
who was on a board in 2019? And who remembers the Uptown Master Plan, which was the predecessor to the form-based code? Okay, so who's on the planning board? ZBA. So you don't like variances. What about town board?
We have a couple on Zoom. sometimes.
And then just a couple interested folks, or is everyone on a board?
ECP.
ECB. Okay. Got it. Okay,
And some staff as well.
yes. Okay, so just a little good context for me. So if you can flip to the next slide, Sarah. So recognizing there are some newer faces, I'm going to start with opposite of what it should be. I'm just going to do a real quick overview of kind of how we got here, remind people kind of how the decision to move forward with the form-based code came about. Do a high-level overview, walk through some of the key elements of the form-based code. And this is a training session, right? And I know there have been some questions that have popped up in discussions over the last months or year or two. So definitely want to keep this open dialogue as well. So feel free to interject, ask questions. I have a couple questions integrated into the presentation where we can pause and you can provide some feedback too. And the goal is, right, at the end of this session, you'll have a little more clarity on how to move forward with implementing the form-based code. So how we got here. So as I mentioned, back in 2019, Bergman and myself were involved in the development of the actual Uptown Master Plan. So that plan really set forward kind of recommendations for land use and desired land use typologies as well as densities within the Uptown corridor of the town. One of the recommendations within that plan was to move forward, for the next slide, with rezoning using this kind of character area map, almost like a future land use plan for all intents and purposes, using this character area map as a base. So really that focused on kind of commercial and mixed use along 332, and then another node of mixed use and residential kind of surrounding Blue Heron Park.
I'm very sorry. Technical difficulties again.
So the goals, some of the goals that came out of that plan, as I just mentioned, right, promoting mixed use development on 332. And it wasn't just about mixed use development, it was about the form of mixed use development, because key fiscal recommendation number 2 really focused on creating a walkable uptown area, right? So really promoting a pedestrian and bicycle friendly scale within that area, which, as we know, does play into kind of development types, development densities, and how development is arranged on a site. So that's an important kind of component to kind of the overall form-based code recommendation that came out. I talked about the mixed-use development centered around Blue Heron Park. And then a large portion of this was really right on wanting to help to spur additional opportunities for residential development to really create that stronger densities in this area. So ultimately, the steering committee that worked on the form-based or the master plan, many of those folks were also involved in the steering committee for the form-based code. And early in that process, as we were starting to look at rezoning consistent with that character area map, we looked at a variety of options, right? We looked at Euclidean zoning, kind of traditional district-based zoning, like you've always had and have in the rest of the town, right? And we talked about pros and cons associated with that approach. why it would or wouldn't work to help support those goals for the uptown corridor. We talked about just doing design standards or guidelines, so essentially having kind of your underlying zoning district and then having an overlay of some form. But at the end of the day, the decision was made to go forward with the form-based code because of its strong focus really on design or performance, right? We don't care so much about what's happening in the building, as long as it's not creating nuisances that we're not comfortable with. We care how that building is interacting with the public realm and the built environment, right? To create that strong form, that pedestrian, walkable, kind of town center feel within the uptown area. Sorry. So some of the benefits of that, obviously provides flexibility in programming. Because you're limiting and restricting just a handful of uses, but you're largely allowing property owners and developers to dictate what's happening within their buildings. Developers do understand, have very clear set of what are the expectations related to the built form of my development. And then it gives you, as I just mentioned, the luxury of saying, okay, I don't care how nice the building is or how well it conforms. There are certain uses we're not comfortable with in the area, so you can still prohibit certain uses. So all of that got us to moving in the direction of the form-based code. And ultimately, the code is organized into 6 really overarching sections. So the overview is really, for all intents and purposes, the introduction to the code. Section 2 talks about that development review process. Section 3 is essentially definitions. Section 4 is really providing the framework for how to apply different regulations in the 2 sub-areas, which we'll talk about. And then the final 2 sections are really specific to those distinct sub-areas. So walking through all of those, and again, at a very high level, so if there's something you want to dig deeper into, feel free to interject and we can pause and talk about those. But with regards to the overview, so within this section, is there a graphic? Or no? Okay, go back. Sorry, I thought we did not again. This is page 2, so this is a boring slide. But so section 1, these are just, as all of you have looked at the form-based code are familiar, these are all the different topics covered in section 1. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. If there are any questions, feel free to ask. I'm really just going to talk about the sub areas, compliance thresholds, which is important, and nonconformities, which I know has come up. So the sub areas, again, through the process and really working with the steering committee in the town back in that 2020-2021 timeframe, really recognized kind of the need for a distinction between development along the 332 corridor and then development, along like Fire Hall and Emerson, kind of those surrounding locations. Which is why there's 2 distinct regulations applicable to those. So compliance thresholds. So this is an important table, right? Especially, and this was recognized very early on in the process, right? The Uptown Master Plan was a pretty progressive planning document for the vision it set forth for the Uptown area, which I think everyone involved in that process would admit was intended to create an area of the town that does, for many intents and purposes, look and feel different than the Uptown area looks and feels today, right? It very much functions as a vehicular pass-through corridor. You drive through, you maybe stop in at a destination along it, but it is not what most people, I don't think, would consider pedestrian-friendly, bicycle-friendly, kind of a destination in and of itself, where you maybe are going there, getting out of your car, walking and visiting multiple places, living nearby, walking to the local restaurant, right? You're driving there, you're parking in the parking lot in front of the restaurant, you're going to the restaurant, you're hopping back in your car and you're leaving. And the intent of the Uptown Master Plan is to really change that dynamic. as the master plan was being developed, I think there was very much the recognition, this is not a light switch. This is not a change that's gonna happen in a year, in 3 years, or 5 years, right? This is a long-term plan. And the implementation and the realization of that plan through the form-based code is going to take a long time. And there is the recognition that the day that this code got adopted, you were going to have a lot of non-conforming uses, especially along that 333 corridor. So recognizing that and recognizing the number of non-conforming sites, the compliance threshold becomes important, right? To think about as you're looking at those sites and they're coming in for minor modifications or changes, to make sure and understanding kind of what they're triggering and what you should be asking them to comply with versus what you may have a little more leeway, right, in making them comply with the form-based code. So if you flip to the next slide, one more, just because I want to kind of make this point, right? With regards to nonconformities and how they relate to those compliance thresholds, the key is really over time encouraging those existing non-conforming uses to transition to the newly compliant standards. There are certain thresholds, going back to that compliance threshold chart, right? If they are substantially changing 90% of their site, they need to be in compliance with the new regulations. But if they are not, and they are, doing a minor addition or some minor site work, yes, you're not going to make them do each and every element of the code. So I just want to be clear, right? That's the intent, is to over time, and as changes are made to parcels that are non-conforming, you just want to start encouraging people to think differently, think about kind of each of those sites moving forward and make gradual incremental changes to get into compliance with the form-based code.
That's
That makes
important.
sense.
That's very important because there's so many non-conforming lots.
So many non-conforming.
Yep.
Yeah. So, within the section of the code itself, right, there's regulations and limitations, right? If a parcel is abandoned for a year and not used for any purpose, and then for more than a year and comes back online 2 years down the road with a whole new use, that parcel should be coming into compliance with the code. The next slide, right? I mean, a lot of, if you go to the compliance threshold table, a lot of thresholds are 50%, right? So, and that's assessed property value as determined by the ZBA. So how the ZBA chooses to determine that, there's a little discretion there as well. And the two key takeaways, I think, for nonconformities are gradual transition, right? Compliance with those compliance thresholds and not increasing the nonconformity, right? I think that is key as well. Any changes that are made should not expand, should not be allowed to expand on that non-conforming use. What are some of the challenges? What are some of the issues that you're having with non-conforming uses?
Can I ask to back up just a little bit?
Yep, go right ahead.
On that one, the second item, the no replacement repair of a non-conforming use shall exceed 50% of the assessed property value as determined by the ZBA. Will you get into how we do that at some point, or is it a question for right now?
Well, we kept this intentionally vague,
Okay.
as I recall, to leave that some discretion, right?
Because from process point of view, from the staff perspective, I look at that and I say, so do we send them to the zoning board before they really get started? Or, to figure out whether or not they meet that threshold? Or,
Well, part of that is, right, like, so are you relying, right, on your just current on the books assessed property value, right? Because everyone in the office will have access to that
Correct,
information. So if the application comes in and you are comparing that, I think you make an early decision about, okay, you know, which path are we sending
Okay,
the applicant on? But I don't think it has to be an automatic going to the ZBA.
fine. Sorry to interrupt.
No, no, it's anyone else, non-conformities.
So
Shannon, you had a, oh, sorry.
for that second point, though, we're only talking about non-conforming uses, correct? Not non-conforming lot structures.
Yes, and that's,
Okay,
but that's still based on like the compliance
Yeah.
thresholds, it's still gonna be, it's still 50%. You go back to the
You had that
compliance
application
threshold.
last night
We did have.
with
an
the
application last night.
vision. And, you know, I think
So like,
what you brought up were good points, because you said how much additional requirement can we make to get them more in compliance, and mention even moving the parking out of the front yard.
Right,
It's good thought. But, I don't know, if, you know, that, I guess it gets into the discretion of the ZBA as to if that extreme a change is warranted at this point, for a minor, but it was a good discussion.
it was a very good discussion, and what I personally struggled with the application last night was go back to that checklist. It actually did number 4, it worsened the non-compliance. It's the actual change is so minor, it's a difficult conversation to have because of that. But technically, they became even further of a setback, and we're supposed to be encouraging moving forward.
so you have a very clear ground for denial right there.
It was certainly part of the discussion.
And right, I mean, part of this, right, is also setting precedent. Right, which I think, you know, boards and staff need to be comfortable with, right, because I don't know what happened last night, it was approved or tabled or moved on, but say it was approved and it increased the non-conformity, right, you now have set a precedent for the next applicant.
It's something
Which
we
got to
talked,
Bob's
that's something
discussion,
we
right,
talked
yeah.
about at length as well,
Yeah.
it's, yeah. But it's definitely something we're struggling with. You have a business owner come to you, in this case, it was a business owner, you have a business owner come to you with a really minor change. I mean, this is a no-brainer, not a big thing, was for a cosmetic reason. And it just, the new form-based code makes you, all of a sudden something that is so tiny is actually very, it's a significant non-conformance, and it's hard to balance that right now. Add to that or whatever, but
Is now a good time to ask and answer on the flip side? An example of when perhaps the zoning board should consider granting a variance in the form-based code.
I mean, it's right in the first meeting,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is Bob Hilliard. May I didn't mean to interrupt.
no,
Okay, I just, I'm learning more, and I have more questions and I'm more confused. So I'm sure you can help me. The issue last night seemed to be fairly benign in the big picture, and trying to see the big picture, we just didn't, with the background that we had, think this was worth taking on. And wasn't unanimous. It was a split vote. But you're saying the ZBA has discretion. If we didn't do it right last night, I'm confused, because how do you define our discretion if we are not working in the direction of what the form-based architects came up with?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, the ZBA does have discretion, I'm just throwing out other considerations for you, right? So like, as you make decisions, just being cognizant of the fact, right, for example. And maybe last night's not a good example, because it sounds like it was very minor, but, moving forward, you 100% have discretion on your decision making, but you need, the ZBA should always be cognizant about setting precedents with their decision making, specifically, with the focus in this area, just because it is a new set of regulations. And it is a significant change from what is there today. And I think, really stressing kind of that incremental, where you can get it, right? Incremental progress towards achieving the vision of the form-based code is going to be important for this code to be successful and for the vision of the Uptown Master Plan to be implemented.
So thanks for, adding to my confusion. I think I heard what you said, but I'm still, I'm trying to figure out, I understand our direction, but getting there in the short term with so many nonconformities, I see this as very challenging. And everything we do is precedent setting, or it's at least writing a new history, because we're in a new territory here. And this is Canandaigua's new frontier.
Yeah.
Hi,
100%.
this is Chris Nadler, the town attorney. The zoning board is very thoughtful on this and wants your guidance. Maybe you could give some examples where a variance might be a good idea, or at least not a bad idea.
So maybe one, right, and it's hard to, I wasn't prepared to come up with examples on the spot. But transparency on an existing building is challenging, right? So especially along the 332 sub area, right? There are some pretty aggressive minimum transparency requirements, which again, a lot of discussion around, and we're very intentional with that overarching goal of really creating a vibrant, active corridor that is geared towards pedestrians, walkability, creating that environment. But if you have an existing building, for example, and even if they are, say they're expanding to the back, they have one of those long, very long lots, and they're expanding back towards Fire Hall Road, expanding the footprint, the assessed value 60%. So, right, triggering all sorts of thresholds. The front facing 332, maybe the transparency today on the lower level is 30%. It's going to be very hard for them without a major facade overhaul, right? And starting to poke more windows into that front facade to achieve that 70% requirement. That may be a prime example if they're meeting the other stipulations. They're meeting the transparency requirements along Fire Hall Road. They're putting their parking where you want it. They're meeting all of the other building requirements. That might be a good example of a variance makes sense here, right? So that's one I can just think of off the top of my head. Maybe there'll be some setback variances, right? A change is occurring. They're not going to get up to where you want them to be along 332, but they're doing everything else that you want them to do to their site. So maybe they get a variance from the setback requirement. I could see that being right. They're making incremental steps and pushing out their front facade 30 more feet isn't feasible or doesn't make sense for a particular application. That may be another opportunity for a variance.
And in both of those examples, what I heard you say, which I think is a good point, is they're trying to meet it in other ways.
Yes.
They're making an effort to meet the form-based code where it is, but there might be an instance where it's just not feasible, where it's cost prohibitive. But they're making effort in other places. That I Notice you mentioned that in both examples, I think that's an important point.
Yeah, right, like if you're doing one of these, right, where you've got most of these boxes have X's in them that require conformance and they're hitting 6 out of 9. Right, that's taking a very favorable step towards compliance, and there could be that a few of those ancillary ones are just not feasible within this.
Thank you, I think that helps. Is that about it?
Are there elements to the form-based code that are more important than others? So should we be less open to giving a variance, for an example, on transparency, but more lenient when it comes to parking? I mean, is there a priority list that goes with what is in the code?
Yeah, you know, I mean, the reality, right, to truly change the character, like, and I'm gonna focus on the 332 sub area.
Right.
To really change that character, you want those buildings all moved up to the street, right? Reducing setbacks and getting parking off of the corridor is truly critical to kind of that overall experience and kind of public realm feeling that you have when you're there. It's also probably one of the most challenging for those
expensive.
non-conforming uses, right? But when there is expansion proposed, expand frontward. So I would say setbacks is probably the most important, but also probably the most challenging for many. Folks that aren't doing kind of major building expansions, right? I do think transparency can be challenging when you have an existing building, and you know, maybe you're not doing a dramatic facade change, right? That can be challenging as well. Bicycle parking, trying to get parking off the, even if you can't move the setback, the building up, you can start creating more green space or outdoor spaces in front of those buildings in lieu of parking, and getting parking to the side in the rear. I think will have a very notable and visible impact on the character of the corridor. You know, the landscaping standards, the lighting standards, screening. Those should all be kind of fairly easy in the grand scheme of things, right, to comply with. So that would be my.
Isn't it also important to note that that answer might be different if you're talking about a new development versus, you know, modifying an existing development?
In my opinion, new development should comply,
Yes.
right? You're gonna have variances with the, you know, most likely with the non-conforming uses as they change. But in my opinion, if there's a new development coming in, there is no reason they should not be able to comply with this code. And I think that's an important precedent to set.
Can you speak to the transparency requirement and why it's so high? And I'm trying to figure out, why do we want a transparent building? Maybe on the first floor to see what's going on inside, but why the whole building? I'm having a problem.
So it's different between the two sub areas, the requirements, and that is intentional too. So if you scroll down, we'll skip some stuff and just kind of focus on questions. We can go back to anything. Yeah, there's a whole section on. So transparency requirements. So within the 332 sub area. Right, so single family residential is not allowed within this sub area. The goal of this, as reflected, right, in this visual, is to have high transparency on the first level, right, to create the eyes on the street, people can see inside the businesses, creating that active, vibrant downtown, encouraging uptown, encouraging the mix of uses, and really activating that ground floor. Once you go to upper stories, right, in 60% is not particularly high for a mixed use building. It's kind of a very, industry standard for an upper story. And within that, you can still have a reasonable amount of privacy if you have residential units on those upper stories, if you have office spaces, or whatever the case may be. The transparency requirements, you go down a few more slides. In the mixed use sub area are, quite a bit lower, recognizing you can have just singular residential units within this area. So again, these are, common industry standard transparency, so they should be, and that includes doors, right? So, none of those thresholds, is that something you're hearing a lot about for new development?
The one for new development, I heard, a year ago, I can't remember what it was, but they said they were having trouble with the transparency on the upper levels because of structure. Is that they had so much structure in that they couldn't open the windows up far enough to get that transparency.
And sometimes, right, we've done form-based codes where it's actually been in more like industrial oriented areas. And what they've done, it's not great, right? Like it's essentially faux transparency, where essentially, they've got industrial operations on the third floor, but a transparency requirement of 65%. And they're creating like a front space and a window, and then 6 feet and a wall, and then their real buildings, right? It's not visible from the street, so not particularly meeting the overall intent, but there are ways to achieve it through some kind of creative building design if there's truly an issue regarding like the use that they're planning.
Could I ask a question, please? I don't know if this ever proceeded to the point of an application. Chuck, you might remember that there was a developer who was talking about the transparency requirements with respect to building an apartment building. And the question became, one of cost to him, that because of the amount of transparency required, he was going to have to use steel construction instead of wood. And, that was going to make the project, very difficult for him. I can't remember all the details about it, but I just remember that I heard that from somebody, that this guy was considering, building, but then he backed away because the cost was just going to be prohibitive, because he had to go to steel instead of using wood because of the size of the building. I think it was several stories high, 3, 4, I can't remember the detail, but there is that in there too. I just wanted to throw it out there because it just popped into my mind, so not to disrupt the meeting. So.
Yeah, that was Edgemere.
Was it?
And-
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and they said glass doesn't have much structural integrity to it. And they had to beef it up with so much substructure to support. And I think they did seek relief from the ZBA for transparency, so they were able to get some relief on it because it was a residential property rather than a commercial industrial.
Was it in the 332 sub area?
It was
On Parkside Drive.
It was over by the.
Yeah.
Because I'm surprised they wouldn't reach that anyway.
Well, and
Fully
sometimes,
residential
I want to say they were at
development,
35%, some reason, I remember 35.
Stick it in your head.
and the other issue with a residential property is the privacy issue. That you have an apartment, if you have an apartment, you don't want all glass, because
And that, yeah, these are showing kind of 40 meeting that threshold. So again, once you get to the upper stories, 40% is really kind of an industry standard, it's not. It shouldn't create any privacy issues having that level of transparency. But right, these are, Sarah, I don't know if you're saying this, right, but like, this is new, right? And if you are finding every application that comes in is requesting variance for transparency. That's time for a discussion of, do we need to change our transparency requirement, right?
Yeah.
And that is at your discretion, and I think if you are consistently seeing the same applications with the same issues that are not working for your community. The first few years of implementing a form-based code, right? I think it would be unreasonable to say there may not be a couple tweaks and refinements that may be necessary. I'm not going to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else on transparency?
No.
Scroll back. I know there were maybe some like questions on approval process as well. And we'll want to start with something, right? And we'll walk through the next couple slides, but you know, targeting questions and jump into them.
I'd say go right through the process because I've seen it, heard it two different ways, so
Okay,
confusing for me, it's planning board.
and actually, if you, I think 2 slides above this is like the administrative approvals. So there is the opportunity for some administrative approvals. You know, site improvements that do not change the number of parking spaces, increase impervious surface area, or, you know, there's no issues, right? Everything looks dandy, everything's in compliance, great. Zoning officer can approve, does allow for some minor expansion of parking lots. And then, you know, basic utility upgrades and stuff. Again, as long as it's not triggering major other complications with the site, the zoning officer can go ahead and approve those administratively. So just wanted to get that one out of the way. And then for obviously the larger scale projects, we go back to that flow chart. Okay, so if a project is under 5,000 square feet, whether it's a new build or an expansion of an existing building, and has less than, so 3 or less residential units, it's going to go to the planning board. If it's over 5,000 square feet and has more than 4 residential units, you know it's going to go regardless of variances or anything, right? So you go to the planning board, you have a town. So those are kind of the overarching big thresholds. So to go to the next slide, you can kind of take those one by one. So for the planning board review process, again, new construction, less than 5,000 square feet, 3 or fewer dwelling units. So I'm gonna go to the planning board, the application. The planning board makes the determination of whether it complies with the form-based code. For planning board members, are you using like the checklist to determine compliance with the different elements?
We just got that.
I think that's
a month ago.
PRC, isn't it?
Happened with the transition office. You didn't know about that checklist. recently.
Yeah, the checklist just showed up recently.
Thank you to some other staff in your office. We got it. For me. So we haven't used
Okay.
it officially in an application yet.
Okay, I was just gonna ask if that's helping, but you guys don't know yet.
You
We have
should,
been giving it to the applicants as well for their use too, and
which I think is helpful.
yeah, and they have found, I mean, the applications that have just, I think we've only had a couple that used it so far. And it is built into our permit system with the form-based code applications, those checklists are built into that, the questions in them. Yeah, I gave the checklist to the planning board just recently, so they have it now.
is there a definition to the detail that that sketch plan should show? Because if you look at that checklist, that's pretty detailed, if I recall,
Yeah,
regarding
and
each
there
one of
are
the.
specific items identified in the code for the sketch plan. Yeah.
So the planning board looks at the sketch plan, we determine if there's any
So
variant or any zoning issues that have to have zoning approval before they.
if there's any right kind of big anomalies or right, you're looking at the first, just kind of the initial, yes, the
Overview.
initial sketch plan. If everything looks good, right, then the applicant will go back and do that full site plan application. Using your checklist, hopefully, right, then you're saying, okay, yes, complies with, you know, you're going back and forth between your compliance thresholds and your checklist to confirm whatever the applicant is requesting and everything it's required to comply with is meeting it. If it does agree, right, or
So that line where it says, does the planning board determine the proposal complies with the minimum requirements?
yes. So then you're approving it or you're approving it and saying it's approved if you move your front facade up 2 more feet. Or whatever the case may be.
We don't approve it, we're just approving that it complies with the
The
minimum
site plan.
requirements, right?
For these smaller projects, you're approving the site plan.
Yeah, less than 5.
For the larger scale projects, it's also going to the town.
Right, yeah.
But you're approving anything under 5,000 square feet, less than 3 dwelling units. For planning,
Okay,
unless
they need a variance. And in that
It's
case,
like it used to be, sketch plan and planning. If it falls within. We see a sketch plan, we tell them what's wrong. They go back and fix it, they bring it back to us for a site plan application and we do 5,000 or under, less than 4.
Yeah.
what we're saying is, they are coming to us and telling us where they don't comply, they know it
in the sketch plan
in the
phase,
sketch plan phase, so we say, well, you're off to the ZBA.
or you could, right, that's a good time to have a and you probably are already doing
Yeah.
this, right, but that's the ideal
According
time
to
to have
sketch
the
plan.
initial conversation, like, hey. Okay, you're telling me you're not complying with A and B, have you thought about this or that, right, to give them a chance to go back and make refinements before doing a site plan application versus automatically just sending them to the ZBA.
But
And
this also.
that's
Well,
probably already happening.
A lot of times they just say, well,
PRC too, though. They go to PRC too, and some of that stuff can happen there. You know what I mean? Right?
well, and a lot of times,
For sketch
at
plan.
first, when they go to Mike, Mike can tell them, well, you don't
Right.
meet this, you don't meet that.
Right.
And they say, well, we can't meet it. I mean, we're willing to take our chances with CBA and we'll go plead our case. And that's more or less what's happening because the degree of changes that have to occur are so expensive and so extensive that they just say, you know, we'll go to the ZBA. Plead our case, take our money, take our chances. So then it goes away from us for a while until the ZBA makes its
Right,
decision.
and it comes back.
And it comes back to us. Okay. That's what we've been doing.
Okay. And then for those, larger scale projects. The process isn't all that different, but you're just adding some. Additional.
It's larger.
Yeah, it's just, some extra steps in there, right? So it's still starting with the sketch plan to the zoning officer. Then going to the project review committee. Then to the planning. More formally, and then, if the planning board says we're good with this, right, then you're making the recommendation to the town board. So the town board's reviewing and then sending back to the planning board for the. If it's a no, right, you're back to the ZBA.
And assuming the ZBA grants the variances, then it comes back up to,
The town board. So if
or it comes back
the,
to the PB or back to TV.
it goes to the town board, so the ZBA
Grants a
reviews,
variance.
the ZBA approves.
Mhm.
It goes to
Okay.
back to the town board. And then to the planning board for approval, so it doesn't actually go back to the planning board to then go, it kind of. Skips that step.
Okay,
And the reason that was done was, kind of in recognition, the planning board had already reviewed and put it in the hands of. The ZBA for all intents and purposes.
So just adding one extra level of the ZBA. And then going,
Back to the-
continue with the process
Yeah.
as it would have.
Yeah, so you could almost put like the ZBA as a potential line here.
I have an observation on this side of the process for the greater than 5,000 square foot. The initial sketch plan review is not done at the planning board, it's done with the zoning. Yeah, at the, what we call our PRC. Sketch doesn't go to the planning board.
doesn't Mike do it ZLD though? Huh? Yeah, so I mean, yeah, it's,
Believe, right, I think we were trying to put more responsibility on the planning board for the, to kind of streamline the planning board process for those smaller
Okay.
scale projects. Cause we had originally talked more about what could maybe be administratively approved.
Yeah.
And the decision ultimately was, let's reduce what can be administratively approved, because it's a pretty tight list of the administrative approvals. But try and streamline the planning board process, because I think there was a lot of conversations. That the process was taking a long time because of all the steps in the review, because so I think even more was going to the town board, right?
I think initially. They were talking about more of them going to the, yeah.
And there was discussion about, let's take the town board out of it completely. Put all of the responsibility on the planning board to make the call to go to the ZBA, but then go back to the planning board. Ultimately, the town board wanted to still have the opportunity to review these larger projects. Which got us back to this approach.
Sarah, do you know if on the applications that are coming in to us, will they say that it's a new construction greater than 5 or less than 5,000, so that we have an indication as I'm reviewing it?
Yeah, so, on the website where we have all of our permit application information, now that I have my hands on these checklists, what I did is put them all on that page under a form-based code category. And typically we're having a phone conversation at least with these applicants before they even get on the cloud permit. And I've been telling them, you need to figure out which one applies to you and use those checklists, and then on cloud permit, I think you select which one, so yes.
Okay.
It should be clear in the application. Which of these checklists, it would fall under, and they should be. Our intent is that they're submitting these checklists, and then you in turn, as a planning board members, can use it yourself, you can print it out and. Follow along with it, or you can just look at the one they provided. Because they're filling them out as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'm sure that was sooner.
We never really found out where that was gonna happen. Someone had asked for it and I said, wow, I didn't know that we are. And then we went down. We found out where they were. There was a paper copy somewhere. And then we got the digital ones. Right.
Any other questions on kind of the process? Here's the last one, I think that's all. Variances we've kind of talked about already. Are there other questions that we haven't hit yet about variances? And again, I would just recommend kind of keeping a running tab of what variances you're approving. Seeing if you're seeing any trends or kind of commonalities, and then going back and looking at potential refinements, right? That don't get you away from the overall intent and vision, but maybe help to kind of create a middle ground of it. What's reasonable from a development perspective, and also achieving the goals of the district. Any issues with signs so far? Next one.
You had some car dealerships do
Yeah.
some signs.
Yeah, the car dealerships tend to want more signs than what the code allows. Very common, right? And then
Corporate trademarks of them.
yeah, they want their
It's gotta be a
logo
certain.
sign and then their own name. And then when they, for a facade, sometimes they're running into issues with that. We've had at least one, two, maybe two. Come through. Can't remember. We have another one that came through recently for a facade update, but they're gonna come back with their signs later. I haven't seen that. We did have some questions about size of the signage. And again, our dealerships, we wish it was larger. It's, it allows for the directional signage and, that there's more allowances for that, but they said, but it's so small.
Has Canada Crossing come up with any sign motif for their new building?
No,
I mean, I know they've been very slow in building it.
I don't believe they have any tenants yet. Pitched out. They had originally had
they have
one, but it is no
Ski-
longer going in there.
Oh,
He said that
That's a shame.
at least that's what I.
No, they're not. I talked to them.
It's vacant.
They're on Main Street and they love it there.
I mean, this was a situation where we had a lot was being developed before the form base was adopted. We said, do you mind adopting it to the form base and move the building all the way out? And they said, that's great, because we can put the parking in the back. And they built it according, well, not totally according to, but for the most part, pretty close.
They actually had to get a variance to build to form-based code standards before form-based code was adopted. To put the building too close.
It stuck out,
Yes,
stuck out,
well, that back some here.
it stuck out like a sore thumb. People started saying, what's that building doing so close to the street? What's going on out there?
They should get credit for what they
Oh,
did,
yeah. The guy was very quiet. Anyway, case study.
Are there any examples of car dealerships which have adopted this form-based code and I don't know, any way of incentivizing? It seems like they're pretty far out of compliance with what's being discussed.
We spoke at length about car dealerships in particular, both when doing the master plan and as part of the form-based code, right? And again, a lot of that discussion focused around this being a law, right? You're not going to push any of your existing car dealerships out, right? That are in non-conformance, but recognizing this is a long-term plan and a long-term vision that over time, those car dealerships may choose to not locate on the 332 corridor anymore, right? And it's what goes in its place once those car dealerships leave. So we do actually, if you go to the sorter, do have a couple images. Maybe like slide 47-ish. 48. So this is an example, I know a couple of people have seen from the Village of East Aurora. It's not a form-based code, but the car dealership, right, took initiative, they pulled their building up to the street and located their lot on the side and on the back. So this is kind of a real life example. There's some interesting, if you go to slide 49, right, where there is a trend, right, where car dealerships are shrinking and they're going more to, I think some, I don't know if it's one of
Yeah,
you,
we were
right,
talking
like
about-
multi-level. And you're really going in and you're designing your car on a computer and ordering it as opposed to having a lot filled with cars. And the last one's just an example. This is a Land Rover dealership in Vancouver, right? So that same model, a 3-story, but right up to the street on all sides and no surface parking around it for the lot. So the existing dealerships you have, it's unlikely they're gonna come into full conformance with the form-based code as is, right? But certainly as they look to expand, if they do want to expand their buildings, getting closer to the street, keeping kind of their surface lots to the side and to the back, and filling in some of that space between their existing building frontage and the roadway would be great kind of incremental changes that they could make to their site that would, again, not get them into full conformance with the code, but start to make some of those gradual baby steps.
Okay, thanks.
Any issues with definitions or any questions on definitions? Generally, we use the same definitions from the existing town code, I would say, across the board. There were a couple new definitions introduced that didn't show up in the existing zoning code, but hopefully there's no major issues there. So then within each of the sub areas, again, the rules generally are just like how to do the measurements, how to apply the different regulations. Are there any issues with, or is any applicants coming in with that? I can't figure out how to figure out my setback or how much building coverage I allow. Straightforward, I feel like it should be. I don't know if you've gotten any applications yet, right, that have really asked for nothing yet, so more to come on these, but again, these are pretty standard right across the board. So there hopefully shouldn't be any issues with regard to some of these kind of building up regulations. Site standards, right? I mean, there are quite a few, introducing like outdoor amenity space, introducing bike parking requirements. I don't know if any of these have popped up yet or been triggered by any of the applications thus far, but I'd be curious if there were any issues, but.
Uptown Landing, they've been in a couple times with just sketches, ideas, concepts. We told them, go change to this and come back, and they haven't come back yet. So I assume Uptown Landing is coming up soon.
Last time we spoke with them, I believe their plan is to come back with an incentive zoning package for this.
Oh,
We don't have an official application yet.
so we're gonna have incentive zoning applied to a form-based code zoning district.
Incentive zoning requests to replace form-based code for their project. Oh. We don't have an application currently. They just didn't have that.
That the one on
How
Firehouse?
makes the cheese more, yeah.
I will say that project, it wasn't because. Again, there's nothing official into us yet, but I don't think they dislike the idea of the form-based code, as you know. You guys at the planning board saw
Mhm.
them a lot.
Other issues.
But there are some new, parties involved with that project. So there's some changes they wanna make.
Okay.
I think they just now, the current group feels that changes they wanna make are enough that it might not make sense for them to come back with form-based code. It would trigger so many variances that it wouldn't matter. Or not that it wouldn't matter, that it wouldn't make sense, but again, I don't have anything to do with that. I still went, what I did see when they did come in, still looks and feels in large part like form-based code, like the original project, just with some changes. Mostly in the single family section of the. We have, not in a current application, but we have had a discussion with someone, I haven't seen them come through with an application yet. But when we were talking with them about site standards, it was for project, they were looking at doing an apartment building in the mixed use sub area. And, they didn't have any issues with the outdoor amenity space. They felt confident that that wasn't going to be a problem. They did discuss transparency on the first level. We did talk about, I think they were proposing like 90 units. And so we did say, well, what if you did some community spaces on the first level along the main road instead of just apartments on the first level on the road facing side? And they seem to consider that. They got more hung up than I expected them to with the parking area, the landscaping.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely more aggressive than your current code
Yeah,
with regards to the landscape requirements, although we did take a lot of kind of your existing as well, but.
When they had another struggle with that one, because they needed the retention pond on the site as well.
yeah.
So that took away
It
a lot of the
was space.
space.
It was a
Yeah,
place
it
issue.
took a
We
lot
wanted
of
to
space
take more
away.
space and-
The trade-off between parking, green space came in.
We haven't seen them come back with anything yet to see what they did with it after our initial conversation. So we have had some other applicants discuss the landscaping requirements too. One was a car dealership. No surprise that they didn't like landscaping in the parking lot, but that also they never came back, so I'm not sure how they were gonna address it either.
And I mean, to trigger landscape requirement compliance to like an existing car dealership, they'd have to be making some pretty significant changes
This
to
one
that site.
was doubling parkings. Pretty much. Also, they were going to do a lot line adjustment, I think, to grab the lot next door and build the parking lot on it. So it was going to be on the side. Just a lot bigger.
We could just at least add landscaping in the new section.
On the site standards. We've had this about it.
Some other than the car dealerships and major issues yet with signage.
Yeah, we haven't had. I'm not really sure we had any applications for much car dealerships that came in for signs yet in one of these district. that way. Before I was over.
Oh, it's-
Yeah.
That's how it's.
Oh, it is, oh, okay.
Joseph, yeah.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Back then.
Not one day's code.
It appears to me, this is Bob Hilliard, that we have a collision in our future with the car outfits, because if each of them or most of them already are pre-existing nonconformities, if they ask for a variance based on their corporate new design or whatever, I definitely can see a collision on the horizon with this, because earlier we were talking about really not supporting variances with pre-existing nonconformities, and I just see it coming based on our past with the car companies, and maybe that'll be different, but at least from my frame of reference, that's what I predict.
And that can very well be, but there are lots of examples where large corporations, right, whether it's a McDonald's or a Walgreens, right, they don't like to admit it, but in their back pockets, they do have alternative signage that they can and will implement when there are regulations that prohibit what their first choice is. So, it certainly won't be the first thing probably any large scale corporation is going to request or ask for. But if signage is important to the community and kind of how that interacts with the corridor and impacts the public realm, it's worth kind of looking at negotiating, right, and looking at opportunities to come into compliance.
Okay, I'm getting a clear, foggy message of what the future might be bringing us. Thanks.
So then, didn't put everything in here for each of the sub areas. Figured bring up anything we haven't covered yet, but obviously the 332 corridor, right? This is intended to be mixed use. We talked about the desire to really create a bike and walkable corridor, the goal of constructing building facades up to the street to help promote that active, transparent ground floor and built environment, and then the real large intent when you're pushing those buildings up is obviously to move the parking beside them.
Do you think the implementation of the master plan as it relates to the public areas, 332, the right of way, the municipal streets coming off of it, if that work is done to improve those infrastructure in those areas, remove the utility poles, put street lighting in, create sidewalks, that would be an encouragement to the private owners to say, hey, they're for real, rather than relying on the private sector to do something.
Yeah.
And they say, well, geez, our customers are driving up this corridor with all these utility poles. What are you guys gonna do? You're into the bargain. And I think, that could help drive the public or the private sector to be more compliant or want to be.
Good old chicken and the egg, but I do think a valid point, right? And we do a lot of like a downtown revitalization initiative program, the New York Forward funding programs in New York State, right? Those are often funding public realm streetscape improvement projects for that very reason, right? Recognizing that, okay, yes, this is economic development program. But by doing those types of projects and investments, right, you're creating that foundation for that private sector investment to come in after. So I do think there's validity to that, right? Doesn't mean you wanna not hope the private sector helps push it along too, but you know, certainly kind of continuing to pursue those public realm projects will go along.
Hopefully with grant money.
Yep.
It's driven by the town's effort to create this form-based district. That,
So again, very short list of prohibited uses within the sub area, probably the most notable being kind of single family residential, not that there were too many single family residential probably applications popping up along the corridor, but right, recognizing that it is intended to be more of a commercial oriented. And then a number of uses that would be very hard to conform recognizably with the form-based code requirements.
so
Talks about transparency. You know, the mixed use, still, you know, the intent of this district was still mixed use, but definitely with more of a leaning towards allowing a range of densities of residential to complement other types of uses, such as commercial, flex, R&D, whatever the case may be. Part of that recognizing like there's a lot of residential that's already occurring on the periphery of this district, so wanting to make sure there was a nice buffering of uses surrounding that residential. Again, prohibited uses really does mimic 332 corridor, except this district obviously allows single families. Minimum lot sizes and setbacks, so again, some kind of flexibility built into this sub area, recognizing, right, if you have a mixed use building along like a fire hall, it might be different than if you have residential uses, you know, single family residential in another area of the sub area, so you know, those mixed use buildings in general, you want to push farther up, residential might be pushed back a little bit, so having those minimum and maximums was important in this subject. And then the lot dimensions, so you know, this essentially, if you look at the minimum, you're creating a 10,000 square foot lot, which, right, is a, you know, fairly compact for town, right? Single family lot size. And that was kind of the threshold we were using, is what's consistent with other higher density, but single family residential developments in town. So that's kind of where we landed with regards to the minimum, the 400 foot max, obviously it shoots to a pretty big over 3 acre parcel, so allowed for a lot of flexibility with lot dimensions, recognizing a lot of different lot sizes exist within this sub area today.
Can you spend a minute talking about that other piece, the required facade within the build to zone? Down at the bottom.
Yes, and I don't. Should have put that graphic.
That's kind of
Yes, so there is, and there's a graphic that represents it within the code that shows kind of how to calculate the build to zone, right, which is again, trying to get buildings within a, you know, to take up a certain amount of that front setback, right, to kind of build that density into kind of the front of the street frontage. Have you had applications with issues with that yet, or more of just it's coming, so we want to be prepared?
It's just, it's not something we talk about in other applications. It's a new idea, and I just thought if we were just kind of
Yeah.
talking about what it is and how we would be looking at it.
Yeah, so essentially it's the area between your minimum and your maximum setback, right? So having kind of the bulk of your facade fall within that zone, somewhere within that zone. So it's a fairly big area along the lot frontage. But again, recognizing, right, you can have undulations in your building facades and things. It's wanting to make sure, right, that you're a large percentage of that building falls within that setback. And right, people can get creative and say, oh, I'm gonna bump out this thing, look at my setback I'm meeting my setback. But really the building's 40 feet back, 80% of the building's 40% back. It's really trying to close a loophole with regards to the building setback essentially.
Yeah, so. You can tell me if this is what we mean by this. So if you have a building that might span like that, in that example, a lot of the front of the lot. And they need to make sure that most of the front of that building is in that at least
Between 5 and
5
20.
feet and 20 feet away from the front lot line.
Yeah.
And not only have one little section of the building, the entranceway, for example, there, and the rest of it farther back.
Right, the rest of it is
To
25
prevent-
feet.
To prevent that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, really, like when folks are doing their sketch plans, right, their site plans, it'd be good for them to show, here's my build to zone, right, and how the building lies within that, because that's going to be one of the requirements on the checklist that they're gonna have to show they're complying.
But someone wanted a sidewalk cafe. They want it right up against the sidewalk, and the building may be behind the actual sidewalk cafe, you understand what I'm saying? So you would be you use 20 or 30 feet for the actual tables and chairs. And then the building itself doesn't start to further back.
The building would still need to be within this setback, so your like sidewalk cafe would have to be above and beyond that, right? Because you still want the building to be, so it's in that other
If
25%.
it's on 232, it's got to be 75% of the facade has to be within the setback.
Right, so but right, like your setback, your building could be at 20 feet. And that still gives you 20 feet between your property line and the building for your sidewalk cafe.
Which I guess is a.
It's, yes.
Never built.
Yeah, sidewalk cafes can be pretty tight. Yeah,
Yeah, I think about some of the restaurants on Main Street when they when they have like 10 or 12 feet.
Yeah.
Along the front, you got some chairs and tables. Like,
They were sort of after the fact, excuse me. They were sort of, as a result of COVID, everybody went outside. And it worked, I mean,
yeah,
happened all over the country, people created al fresco.
Some of those on Main Street go into the right of way too. A little,
Yeah.
a little bit, yeah.
People were walking around tables.
well, as you start to transform uptown, and you're seeing more sidewalk cafes come in, right? A lot of communities are now developing separate sidewalk cafe guidelines, right? To make sure you're providing enough space for the ADA access, even some communities are allowing them out in the roadway, right, where the on-street parking is, and creating spaces, regulating those spaces too, so. So those were kind of the highlights I extracted. Based on some initial feedback, but any other topics the folks wanna address or any other questions?
With it being on State Route 332, is it something the state has to move on to? You know, removing the telephone poles and all that electric stuff.
Any right of way, like changes to the right of way. DOT would get involved. You know, if you were to. Yeah, separated like, you know, some of the other like more transportation oriented recommendations from the master plan. Yes.
And if it's changing like adding a curb cut or anything like that, you know, we end up referring it to them anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, you're not gonna just take one pole out. And then for this one building, you're gonna do them all at once. You know what I'm saying? That's gonna be quite the state.
Well,
Those
that's,
poles aren't going anywhere.
I was gonna say, we still have holes in our, you know, renderings, a lot of them, because that's a very,
that may be coming sooner rather than later. Because of all the car dealerships we have, again, we're years out, but RG&E has noticed there's too much of a need. Because all the car dealerships now require X amount of amperage voltage coming into the building. RG&E can't supply every car dealership, so they are already looking at how to operate that area better.
maybe,
Work it out.
which is huge, because
Yeah.
they don't do that voluntarily very often.
How does that fit in with the EV that we're trying to push, charging units?
That's what it's for.
That's what it's for.
Yeah, so generally what they're looking at is every single car dealership needs to have 10 EV charging stations. 2 of them for public use or in the parking lot, the rest are obviously maintenance and dealership storage, etc., but also battery storage. So,
But you gotta remember, electric is a different thing on those poles, so. The other companies aren't gonna go anywhere, they're not forced to.
RG&E enforcement too.
No, they can't,
They'll put them in the ground if they want to.
separate companies.
So I see references to bicycle parking here and there. Is there also plans for bike lanes, trails, paths is part of this development?
That is all part of the Uptown Master Plan. Right, so the zoning, the form-based code doesn't get into that, as a lot of those recommended improvements would be more, to your point, you know, public
Yeah.
enhancements and improvement projects. But a lot of the regulations, right, like the bicycle parking, kind of the access, all tie into that, you know, ultimately that overall vision and the connectivity between the public and the private.
Yeah, that was a big part of the discussion with the Uptown feasibility study. There's all kinds of renderings and sections in there that talk about ways to improve active transportation along the corridors, but yeah, again, most of that is in the right of way.
Yeah. Yeah, I know the city had entertained thoughts of developing bike paths, bike lanes along Main Street. It'd be nice if that ever came about to integrate it with what's being done uptown.
Yep.
Anyone have any other questions about any of the processes in form-based code or any of sections of the code itself, especially these board members that didn't get covered already?
I think we need to see more. We don't have any much application to go off. One of the.
Well, I know I made things fuzzier for Bob, but hopefully maybe some of this provided a little clarity.
At my age, I'm getting more used to being fuzzy, so I appreciate your help and also speaking with other people. I'll sort this out. I'm in favor of the project, and I think the future is great, but it's the short term, the people who are currently in a nonconformity that troubles me. But it has really nothing to do with your fine presentation.
No, there's definitely going to be a bumpy period, I think, in implementing this with the number of non-conforming properties that exist.
Well,
Thank you so much.
thank you again for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
And I feel like I have a better understanding after listening to it. It helps just to hear someone else go through it, besides me just reading through it by myself. So thank you.
And you obviously know you can call me anytime if another application comes in and, you want to talk through anything or get a different perspective.
And to the board members who came, zoning board, planning board, town board, thank you very much for coming.
No, it seems to me that it's gonna, as Bob was referring, it's gonna be a little bumpy at first, but we don't have that much experience with it yet, so as more applications come in and you can bounce them against form-based code to look at where issues are, it'll be a living document like all of our codes, so.
Yep.
If changes are required, that's why we have an ordinance committee, so we
Yep.
look into those things and it's gonna be, I think it's a good idea all in all, so it's really going to set that area apart, so. But we need more experience.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.